Joining us in the studio today, the Calhoun County Sheriff, Matt Saxton. Good morning.
Good morning, Richard.
Also today with us is the Calhoun County Chief Health Officer, Jim Rutherford, today. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Richard.
Boy, you hear about Zika and all these other things, and then here we have in Calhoun County a story about something called Thallium, and that made us wonder what the heck that is. So we appreciate the time you're giving us today to talk a little bit about it. What is it, Jim?
Well, thallium is a naturally occurring metal. It is a product that historically has been used, particularly back in the 70s. It was used in rat poisoning a lot of times. It's very toxic metal. You can get exposure in different ways, obviously through touch, through dermal exposure, through inhalation, and then through actually ingesting the thallium. It has been banned for use in the United States for a very long time because of its toxicity. And it's very rare that we get thallium exposure in the United States. We probably average about one exposure on an annual basis. The unique thing about this particular situation is that in Upper Michigan, in the UP in Houghton, Michigan, about 10 months ago, we experienced a thallium exposure that resulted in death. So the fact that we have 2 thallium poisonings within a year in Michigan is of note.
Wow, that's incredible. So you said on average one nationwide?
That's correct.
And now we've had 2 in Michigan. That's incredible.
We have.
Wow. What are the typical ways someone is exposed to this now that it's banned? And, you have to sort of sort this out. But if someone is exposed, is there a conclusion you've reached as to the most common way?
Well, unfortunately, the common way that we've in the research that I've done is that it's intentional poisoning. Unfortunately, so this toxin is also referred to as the poisoner's poison. So it's been used historically as an intentional poison. Now it is being still manufactured in other parts of the world, and it is still in our potentially in our system. So it's not completely out of our realm of possibility that you could get it through just being exposed through the work environment. Certainly not in the United States, but we buy and sell products, all over the world now. So it's not terribly uncommon that you would get the likelihood from exposure through another source other than intentional. But the ones that we've looked at, particularly in the United States, oftentimes it goes back to an intentional poisoning.
Wow. Hence, when we have a case like this, law enforcement gets involved.
Well, yes, and initially in this case, we were contacted by the health department 2 Saturdays ago, and Jim advised that they had a victim in the hospital that had been poisoned by thallium. At that point, we started a joint investigation with the health department, EPA, CDC, FBI, initially just to locate the source of the poisoning. And we continue to, right now, we're continuing to locate that source of the poisoning. Thankfully, the victim in this case is getting better. He's able to talk now, so
good.
Once he gets stronger, we'll have an opportunity to interview him. I think both the health department will interview for their side, and then we at the sheriff's office will interview the subject. At this point, we don't have anything leading us to believe that it's an intentional poisoning. We don't have any information that the general public is in any danger, but we will continue our investigation to locate the source of this poisoning in this incident. And it doesn't.
Yeah.
Jim mentioned the 2 cases here in Michigan over the last 10 months. We have found no ties from the one up in northern Michigan to the one locally here.
And that's part of the reason why we've asked you to visit with us today, because you hear something like this, particularly when you hear other stories like Zika, for example, which I guess is the most current example, that, you know, you hear about these sorts of things in other locations, and then you start to hear, well, there's one in Florida, well, there's one in Michigan, and you start to concern yourselves with the notion of a public health threat. In this case, it's not.
Well, you know, from the beginning, our objective obviously is to identify a source, and from our public health position is that we want to first and foremost try to identify where the source is, and then to mitigate or remove that potential source so that we can avoid secondary poisonings. Obviously, this individual has a family, has children in his life. So we spent a significant amount of time, again, in unison with law enforcement in the house. We've tested all of the individuals that he lives with or that have access to the house. Thankfully, none of the family members have come back with any levels of thallium in their system. You know, as you continue to go, you expand out our public health surveillance. We looked at his work environment. We've sat down with all of the people that he works with to assure that none of them have exhibited any symptoms. So it's really a lot of surveillance work to be able to identify, you know, is there a source, and if so, how do we remove that source from concern?
Once you've covered those bases, as you've done, is it surprising that something didn't show itself as a potential source here?
Go ahead.
The tough part with this investigation is we were notified probably 10 to 15 days into his original onset of his poisoning, which occurred back, we're looking at July 20th area.
I see.
And he continued to get checked medically and was initially misdiagnosed with a different disease.
Oh, boy.
So by the time we got involved in the health department and they contacted us, the gentleman involved in this case was in the hospital in a coma and unable to. So that person that was poisoned would give us the best information on where to lead to find the source. We've put hundreds of man hours in interviewing, searching locations where this gentleman had been to assure there is no thallium in those areas.
Yeah, so the circumstances of this case make that, I presume, then somewhat unique, that usually you'd have the person at the center of it able to give you information. In this case, that didn't happen, so you're left to your own devices in terms of trying to figure out where this came from.
That's true, and it's not uncommon that misdiagnosis occurs with thallium exposure. This individual was actually diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome, which it's happened in several instances nationally in terms of it being diagnosed as that particular disease, and then he was being treated for that disorder.
Wow.
Before they realized something else is going on here. So somebody had the wherewithal at Bronson Kalamazoo to say, well, let's do a metals test. And that's when they identified that the metals came back extremely high. And, you know, you and I may be tested for thallium. Again, it's a naturally occurring element. So there may be some people that test, particularly smokers. If I were to test a smoker for thallium, they might have it come back as 1 or less than 1. This individual tested the first time well above 160. So the actual exposure was pretty significant. And, you know, going back to your earlier question, Richard, it's from the beginning I was kind of worried that we would end up with where we're at right now in terms of just not being able to locate a source, which, we've checked, we've exhausted every possibility, in terms of the hobbies, in terms of, this patient's circles, and we've just come up with nothing. So the fact that he is improving, I think will be helpful for us to be able to sit down with him and kind of do a history, a surveillance history of, where he's been and what he's eaten and things like that, to be able to hopefully get a better idea as to potential sources of exposure.
Jim Rutherford's here, County Health Officer, and Sheriff Matt Saxton. We're talking about thallium. Sheriff Matt Saxton here, and Jim Rutherford, the Calhoun County Health Officer. We've been talking about thallium a little bit. Without asking you to speculate, the notion, though, here is if some of the naturally occurring ways that someone might encounter this have been checked, it kind of points towards some kind of malfeasance here, would you think?
Well, and that's what we want to learn when we have an opportunity to talk to the victim in this case. I'm thankful that he is doing better, and oftentimes we wouldn't have that opportunity to talk to a victim in a case such as this. So I think we'll learn some more when we have an opportunity to talk with the gentleman involved in this case. But through our investigation, joint investigation with the health department and CDC and EPA and all the acronyms, it's been a continuous workload since 9 days ago. Be 2 weeks this Friday.
Yeah. So, Jim, this is banned. It's not something that you run down to the store and buy easily, right, these days. But if you were to be exposed to it, a person would be, how would that happen? Just by accident?
That's what we really scratch our head about in terms of the accessibility of thallium. It's somewhat, I would think it's pretty hard to get your hands on. And, I did a lot of internet searching just to satisfy my own curiosity relative to where someone could get this. I think you'd have to be pretty savvy with, first and foremost, it'd have to be black market. It'd have to, come from a different part of the world. My understanding is that possibly you could get it, it's nothing that you see on eBay, let's just say that much.
Right.
So that's the perplexing part, is that if it was indeed intentional, you're talking about something that would be relatively hard to get your hands on. In some of the historical cases that you see, oftentimes the people that were doing the poisoning were actually people that were they were methamphetamine processing plants. They knew their way around a chemistry lab, so there was some knowledge and wherewithal, and we're just not finding that in this particular situation. There was no indication that there was any illegal drug activity in the household. There doesn't seem to be a smoking gun for us, and that's the frustrating part. And I know that Matt's people are just as frustrated as we are, because, again, our ultimate objective is to assure that we're getting dangerous products like this, or dangerous elements like this, out of the access of the general public in our community.
You talked about the idea that the exposure here in this case is quite significant. Could a one-pot meth lab situation expose you to enough thallium to make you this sick?
Well, and the connection to meth, it's not the typical one-pot meth-making process that we see here. It's the foreign process that we don't see that often here. We saw no connections in this case to meth. The other thing, this has been a banned substance in the U.S. since 1972, so some 43
years.
Years ago. But it's not uncommon, or it wouldn't be, it's not uncommon for us to get a call to a subject's home where they're cleaning out a house that their grandparents lived in and died at the age of 90, and they find a grenade or something,
Right,
or
it's been
dynamite in their shed. So the possibility, was he involved in cleaning out an old building or something? Did he run across it in that way? So
And I think that's a really good point that Matt brings up. You know, a lot of, and we just had our household hazardous waste collection, Recycle-Rama, last weekend. You wouldn't believe the products that we get brought in that are unlabeled. That, yeah, I found this in Grandpa, shed, and we don't know what it is. And that's not terribly uncommon. And we just have so many chemicals that are laying around. And my understanding from the scientists that I've had conversations with is the toxicity level of thallium doesn't dissipate. So thallium that's been sitting on the shelves in 1970 may have oxidized, but it's just as toxic as it was in 1970. It's just as toxic today as it was 44 years ago. So, that's a reality too. And we always recommend to people, if you find something that you don't know what it is, treat it like it's a very toxic, product, because most likely it is. And a lot of products that we used 30, 40, 50 years ago are banned today. So that's why we have those recycling opportunities. But again, Matt makes a great point that when we talk about accessibility, this could have just been a product that's been laying around that somebody got their hands on and got exposure to.
Sounds like that might be more of a possibility than the whole black market idea. But as you get briefings about black market activity in our area, does thallium come up in that discussion?
Well, and not at all. And Jim called me Saturday morning from the Recycle-Rama. Because this has been in the news, the gentleman brought a container in and dropped it and said that's thallium, and
oh my,
basically took off. So
yeah, we weren't sure if he was having a little bit of fun with us, but we had to treat everything
take it seriously,
of significance, particularly since we've spent the last week in dealing with this day in and day out. So we don't take anything with a grain of salt.
And we did look into that, and it was not thallium.
The other thing too, getting back to the discussion about methamphetamine, we've had so many meth busts in both Calhoun and Kalamazoo County that I think that if thallium was an issue with meth cooks, we would have had more poisonings and more exposure. So I don't think that the correlation is that strong that this is surrounding any type of methamphetamine activity.
All right. Well, we appreciate the time you've given us and the update on that. We're glad to hear that this person is doing better and that you're on the case. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Sheriff Matt Saxton and Jim Rutherford, Calhoun County Chief Medical Officer.